I have never gone to church here. I do have a special connection to this building in that I was baptized. In 1978 in October, so 47 years ago, I was baptized here. And so this makes it a special place for me because it's the place I first made covenants with the Lord. When Mormon was compiling the spiritual history of the family of Lehi, one of the most beautiful things he wrote about was about a baptismal place. It was about 500 years before his writing. He was writing about Alma having escaped from King Noah and taught the people in the wilderness and then baptized people at the waters of Mormon. He was named after this place, and so it was obviously a special, that had special meaning for him. But this is what he wrote. He said, talking about Alma's experiences, he says, "It came to pass that this was done in Mormon, yea, by the waters of Mormon, in the forest of Mormon, the place of Mormon. How beautiful are they to the eyes of them who there came to the knowledge of their Redeemer. Yea, how blessed are they, for they shall sing to his praise forever." I don't have the eloquence of Mormon, but I've also become interested in religious history like he was. I've researched some of the history of the church in Edmonton, and through my professional career as an urban planner responsible for heritage planning, I've done some special focus on some of the buildings that the church has built here in Edmonton from the early days until when this building was established. And so here goes. The church's history in Edmonton begins before there were any church members there. And you may ask, how does that happen? Well, it's because ideas and prejudices spread faster than human beings do. And so it was when the first Latter-day Saints came to southern Alberta in 1887 that the newspaper writer of the time, his name was Frank Oliver, he owned the Edmonton Bulletin, was very harshly critical of church members because there were prejudices about polygamy and that kind of stuff. Like the writings were very, very critical. And then a few years later, in 1894, when Edmonton had a population of 1,000 people, none of whom were Latter-day Saints, a play was put on in Edmonton. There were different touring groups of theater artists, and this play came to Edmonton and performed a play called The Danites in the Sierra. It was basically an anti-Mormon play. And so this is just like setting the ground. This is before there were any Latter-day Saints in Edmonton. The first member of the church that I've heard of coming to Edmonton was a man named John Wolfe. So Alberta was established as a province in 1905, and there was a constituency, a political constituency in Cardston. And guess what? The person who was elected, John Wolfe, was a member of the church. And so he came up to Edmonton in 1906, stayed in a hotel on Jasper Avenue, and he may have been the first Latter-day Saint to actually come to Edmonton. Incidentally, when members of the church started voting for the Liberal Party, which is the party that Frank Oliver, the Edmonton Bulletin, subscribed to, the Edmonton Bulletin started talking really nice things about members of the church. They discovered that they were really good people after all. So there was a politician or two that came up from southern Alberta, but the first members of the church who seemed to have lived here were university students. So the University of Alberta was established in 1908. And the university's yearbook in 1911-1912 says that there were 185 students at the university, 3 of whom were Latter-day Saints. So we had at least 3 members in 1911-1912. Opposition to the church didn't go away. In those early years, like 1913-ish, the leader of the Presbyterian Church of Canada was a minister in Edmonton named Reverend McQueen. And he was very concerned about the church and spoke publicly, against the church and specifically further Latter-day Saint immigration into Alberta. So we were still getting opposition. But right about that time in 1914, the first family moved to Edmonton. It was Robert and Fanny Gordon. Robert was a surveyor, and he had been hired by the provincial government to be the assistant director of surveys. And so they came to Edmonton and lived in Garneau. Right about then, there was an economic crash, and then World War I, and as a result of that, there wasn't any further growth of the church in Edmonton. But when things picked up in the 1920s, Latter-day Saint students again moved up to Alberta. And then when the Depression hit, there were families from southern Alberta who were looking for work, essentially, who moved to Edmonton in search of employment. There were two families, two brothers whose last name were Strati. When the second Strati family moved up, this led to the first recorded Latter-day Saint church meeting in Edmonton. It was held at the home of Alfred and Mabel Strati in February of 1933 with 15 people in attendance. The house still exists. It is in the Alberta Avenue area. So the Stratis had church in their home for a couple of years, but the population continued to grow and they needed something bigger. And so in 1935, two things happened. First, a branch was established. So the first formal church organization was established in 1935, the Edmonton branch. And Alf Strati was the branch president. And then they rented a hall, and it was a hall on White Avenue. The building still exists. If you know White Avenue, it's on the south side of White Avenue, just across the street from the Strathcona Hotel. It's a building called the Ross Block. It's got these curved arches, two curved arches in it. And upstairs at the time was a hall that was used for a whole bunch of things, political meetings and theater performances, and also church meetings. So that was the first rented hall that the church used. There was a lot of economic desperation during the Depression, and that led to a change in government. So in 1935, the Social Credit Party were elected, and their MLA from Cardston was named N. Eldon Tanner, and he became just a really amazing force for the growth of the church in Edmonton.
Quick side note, while I'm editing this video 4 months after the anniversary event took place, I thought it might be helpful to go a little bit deeper now that we have time into the story of N. Eldon Tanner.
As I saw my family stand here, I realized I had my own cheering section. I'll signal to them when I want them to cheer. I'd like to give you an experience I had some years ago when I was president of the branch in Edmonton.
If you were listening carefully, you could hear every time he mentions him that Bishop Backstrom's voice would crack a little bit. And I think that's the burden of anybody who's come to know the remarkable life and influence of N. Eldon Tanner.
My dear brethren, I stand before you this evening in all humility. What a glorious privilege it is to hold the priesthood of God. From the newest deacon in the smallest and most distant branch of the church to the high priest holding the highest office in the church.
I would just mention briefly that his story is not dissimilar from a lot of the leaders that we've had in this area. He was raised on a farm in southern Alberta. He had to borrow money to attend university.
After finished my school in Raymond, Father said, well, we need you on the farm. He said, if you can arrange the money, we can't finance it, but if you can arrange to borrow the money, we'll sacrifice your help on the farm. So I went to the bank. I was frightened to death. I never talked to a bank and told him what I wanted. And he said, are you Carl Tanner's boy? And I said, no, I'm N.W. Tanner's boy. So he let me have the money that I needed. That was a very, very significant thing in my life when he knew that I was N.W. Tanner's son. And I made up my mind right then that I'd try to live so that I would have that kind of name when my children came along.
He met and married a remarkable woman.
And I said to one of the fellows, who's that beautiful black-eyed girl up there? And they said, that's Sally Merrill from Hill Spring. I didn't know where Hill Spring was. But I said to them, you know, someday I'm going to marry that girl. When I said that about her, she had seen me down in the corner of this other room. She said, who's that homely kid down there? I love her and appreciate her and thank the Lord for her. I don't think I ever pray, but what I thank the Lord for my wife and pray that, and for the love we have for each other, pray that we may continue to carry on that way.
I have always wanted to support my husband. I made up my mind early in my marriage that I would never stand in his way in this church work in any way. I would do all I could to support him.
It's a tremendous thing for a man to have a wife that will support him in all things and help him do better.
Eldon Tanner served as the Speaker of the Alberta Legislative Assembly, and then he became the Minister of Lands and Mines, and really became one of the most prominent politicians in Alberta at the time. There was also another cabinet minister named Solon Lowe, who was also a Latter-day Saint. And so just these two brothers and their families moving to Edmonton increased the church by quite a bit. In 1938, the church meetings moved from the Ross Block into Orange Hall, which is a little wood structure that still exists across the alley from the old Strathcona Farmers Market. And it was in this little building that the church, like a branch existed, but the church organization more fully was established. So those of you who are members of the Relief Society, the very first Relief Society was established in Orange Hall. So next time you go to the farmers market or in that area, you look at that little building and think that's ground zero for Relief Society in Edmonton. It was also the first place the Sunday school was established. It was the first place that youth programs were established. And the first primary of the church was also established in Orange Hall. So a very small little building with a lot of church history built in. But coming back to Eldon Tanner, he was a real powerful leader and made things happen. He was called as the branch president in 1939. One of the first things he did in terms of the growth of the church was to convince church authorities to establish a mission here. In September of 1941, the church established the Western Canadian Mission, which was based in Edmonton. It was the timing, I think, was pretty miraculous, because if you think about what was going on, Canada, Britain, and many other countries were engaged in World War II at the time, but the United States, which is where most of the missionaries came from, was not. And so the church, there were missionaries who needed to go places, and maybe Edmonton seemed like a safer place than Europe at the time. And so the church established a mission. It was just a few months later, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and the United States got into the war, and that mission probably wouldn't have been created. The war brought a lot of American servicemen, some of whom are members of the church, to Edmonton. So that was another boost to the church here. Church meetings were moved to a hall downtown, and then to another hall a couple of years later in Norwood. So the church kept moving to bigger premises as the branch increased. But President Tanner wasn't satisfied with just rented halls. He wanted a dedicated church building that members could meet in. And in 1944, he got the church to buy a property on White Avenue and develop plans, with the church architect to do a building there, but they couldn't because of wartime rationing. But at least they had the land. And in 1949, they were finally able to break ground. In 1951, the White Avenue Chapel was dedicated, the first building the church owned in Edmonton. At the same time, just like he had pushed for a mission, President Tanner pushed for an institute building. The early members of the church in Edmonton were university students. And I think President Tanner, not that I ever met him, I think he just felt that the institute would just help solidify things and help Edmonton be a strength. And so in 1953, the Institute of Religion opened, and it was the first institute the church had built outside the United States. And so a really great thing. I'm a YSA bishop right now. I love the Institute. The young people of the church are just so beautiful, and it's just it's a total privilege for me to meet every Sunday at the Institute and think about the vision that President Tanner had for the church here. Sorry, I was getting more emotional than I thought I was going to get. The two church buildings that were built not only gave great facilities for church members, but they were an impetus for further growth. My father he grew up in Edmonton, of a Lutheran background, and one day in the early 1950s, he said, "I'm going to go into that church on White Avenue," and he went in and he met the missionaries and was baptized, and so they were a force for an additional growth in the church. President Tanner retired from government and moved to Calgary, where he became the first stake president in Calgary. But membership in the church continued to increase. In 1953, the Edmonton branch, there was still only one branch in Edmonton at the time. In 1953, they were divided into two branches. And then eventually 2 branches became 4. And then in 1960, a stake was established. So the Edmonton stake had 5 wards in Edmonton and a branch in Red Deer. And there were about 2,000 members in the stake. In the 1960s, Edmonton continued to grow rapidly because of the oil industry and that kind of thing. And then missionary work was continuing, and the church continued to grow. The Bonnie Doon Stake Center was finished in 1961 and dedicated the following year. So this left 3 buildings. This is where we get to where you are today. This left 3 buildings on the south side of the river, but none north of the river. And so the new stake presidency, which was led by President Lee Rollins, got to work on meeting the needs of members in this part of the city. They got approval from the church to build a building, bought this building on the 31st of January 1964. I looked it up in the city's records, got a design finalized, received a development permit on April 30th. So this is moving quite quickly, right? They bought the land at the end of January, had a development permit in April, and broke ground in May. President Rollins' biography estimates there were 25,000 hours of stake volunteer labor, plus invaluable contributions from 12 building missionaries. I'm sure we'll hear more about that today. And because of all that work, the building was completed in just over a year. And then the city granted an occupancy permit, which allows the building to be used, in October 1965, which is exactly 60 years ago. The building was dedicated by, guess who? President Tanner, who is now in the First Presidency. This is just a high-level summary of the church's growth in Edmonton until the 1960s. And I obviously haven't talked about the individuals whose lives were changed and the families who served so faithfully. But everything that I've learned about the history of the church in this far-off northern metropolis confirms what Joseph Smith wrote down, a revelation he received in 1831 when the church was just a year old. He said, "Wherefore be not weary in well-doing, for ye are laying the foundation of a great work. And out of small things proceedeth that which is great." I think that you can agree with me that this building and all all the faith and the testimony and the spiritual growth that's been associated with it is part of that great work that's going on. I want to just indulge in a little bit deeper planning history if I can. I'm an urban planner. Many people don't know that in World War II, when the Americans came and they were building the Alaska Highway and had all sorts of other projects, there were lots of American soldiers here. They needed to have a warehouse or a bunch of warehouses to get things off trains, to ship them up to other places. And so the American government built a rail spur that went right here, so right through this area, and built a whole bunch of warehouses, like 12 big timber warehouses. So if you were to look at this area in 1945, when the war ended, it was just it was like an industrial area with big warehouses. The city of Edmonton, the land was owned by the federal government. The city of Edmonton ended up buying that land after the war. They wanted to encourage businesses to set up in these empty warehouses, and so they sold them off to different companies. And after oil was discovered in 1947, Imperial Oil, for example, bought some of the warehouses. But then in 1949, Edmonton established a planning department, and it was headed by a British planner named Noel Dant. This area was called the American Railhead because of the rail spur and all the different warehouses that the American government had built. He looked at this American Railhead and he didn't like it. He wanted to kind of separate industrial areas from residential areas, and he just felt like bringing industrial areas south closer to some of the neighborhoods that were under development was wrong. And so Noel Dant convinced the city to buy back some of these properties that they had previously sold in order to turn it into a neighborhood. And so it may sound strange, but he convinced the city council to do this, and so the city in the late 40s and early 1950s spent hundreds of thousands of dollars buying up these properties to turn it into a neighborhood. And I say that because if Noel Dant hadn't have done that, then this area would have been an industrial area. But as it is, if you look on a map, all the industrial uses are north of 111th Avenue. And so we ended up with, a property that the church could buy and build this church on. So do any of you know the name of the neighborhood that the church was built in? It's McQueen. So the neighborhood is named McQueen. We talked about McQueen a few minutes ago. McQueen was this Presbyterian minister who was so hostile to members of the church. And so I like to think that we got the last laugh on Reverend McQueen, in that the neighborhood named after him is where one of the early chapels of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was built. And so thank you for your time, and I look forward to the other speakers.